2 weeks into the battle for Stalingrad, and Hans no longer thought in terms of streets or blocks. He thought in rooms, buildings, sometimes just walls. The city had become a vertical maze where Soviet soldiers could be above you, below you, behind walls you'd already cleared. The neat lines of advance they'd learned in training meant nothing here. The factory district was a nightmare of twisted metal and concrete. The Red October factory had become a fortress, each workshop and assembly hall a separate battleground. Hans's platoon, now down to 23 men, had spent 4 days fighting for a single building, a massive brick structure that the Soviets defended with fanatical determination. "Why do they care so much about a tractor factory?" Klaus asked one evening as they sheltered in what had been a foreman's office. His youthful face had aged in the past 2 weeks, his eyes carrying a haunted quality that came from too many near misses, too many friends lost. "It's not about the factory," said Feldwebel Otto Hartmann, the grizzled sergeant who'd survived the last war and seemed determined to survive this one. At 43, he was ancient by infantry standards, his face mapped with scars and his manner perpetually bitter. "It's about making us pay for every meter, making us bleed, making us afraid." "I'm not afraid," Friedrich said, but even he sounded less certain now. "We're winning. Look at the map, we control most of the city. We control ruins," Otto spat. "And the Ivans control enough of it to keep killing us." Hans said nothing, but he felt it too, the subtle shift in the fighting. The Wehrmacht was still advancing, still pushing toward the Volga, but the advance had slowed to a crawl. For every building they took, a dozen remained. And the Soviets kept fighting, kept appearing from nowhere with rifles and grenades and a determination that bordered on madness. The nights were getting colder. Hans had begun sleeping in his greatcoat, and still he woke shivering. The promised winter uniforms hadn't arrived. Supplies in general had become erratic. Some days they had plenty of ammunition but no food, other days the opposite. The Luftwaffe was supposed to be keeping them supplied, but the Russian fighters were getting bolder, and transport planes were increasingly rare. "Did you hear about the 94th Division?" Klaus whispered one night as they huddled around a small fire in the ruins. "They took a building yesterday, found 30 Russian soldiers hiding in the basement. Women, some of them, factory workers. They fought till they were all dead." "Commissars make them fight," Friedrich said with certainty. "Force them to die for Stalin. We're liberating them, really?" But Hans remembered the faces of the Soviet soldiers he'd seen, glimpsed across burning streets, found dead in the rubble. They hadn't looked like people forced to fight. They'd looked like people defending their home. The German offensive renewed in mid-October with ferocious intensity. General Paulus, commanding the 6th Army, had ordered a final push to reach the Volga and split the Soviet defenders. Hans's division participated in the assault on the Barricadi factory, a massive complex of industrial buildings that seemed to stretch forever. For 3 days, the German forces threw everything into the attack. Tanks rumbled through the streets, artillery pounded Soviet positions until the very earth shook, and infantry units like Hans's squad pushed forward in waves, taking casualties but gaining ground. On the evening of October 16th, Hans stood on the banks of the Volga River, looking across the dark water at the Soviet-held eastern shore. They'd done it. They'd reached the river. The 6th Army controlled 90% of Stalingrad. "We've won," Friedrich said, and this time he might have been right. "They'll surrender or be pushed into the river. The city is ours." Lieutenant Vogel organized a celebration that night. A meager affair of shared cigarettes and a bottle of schnapps someone had found in a cellar. But it felt like victory. They'd survived Stalingrad, broken the Soviet defense, proved once again that the Wehrmacht was invincible. "When do you think we'll be relieved?" Klaus asked. "Surely they'll pull us back. Let us rest before winter." "Soon," Vogel assured him. "Once the mopping up is done, they'll rotate fresh divisions in. We've earned a rest." But the relief never came. The Soviets still held a narrow strip along the Volga, barely a kilometer wide in places, and they refused to surrender. Supplies continued to arrive across the river at night. How, Hans couldn't fathom, with German artillery hammering the crossing points, but arrive they did. And the Red Army kept fighting. The weather turned. October's cold was gentle compared to what was coming, but Hans felt it in his bones. Still no winter uniforms. Still no word of relief. Just orders to hold the line, contain the Soviets, prevent any breakout. "Something's wrong," Otto said one night. The old sergeant rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. "We should have been relieved by now. We should have received winter gear. We should be seeing reinforcements." "We'll get them," Friedrich insisted. But even he sounded less confident. "Command knows what it's doing." Hans wasn't so sure anymore. He'd begun to notice things, the way Vogel's reports emphasized the same victories repeatedly, the way the radio broadcasts from Berlin talked about Stalingrad in the past tense, as if the battle was already won. But outside the ruined buildings where they sheltered, Soviet soldiers still fought, still killed, still refused to die. For days after the Soviet offensive began, the news came down. The Soviet pincers had met at Kalik, 50 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was encircled, cut off, trapped. The Kessel, the soldiers called it. The cauldron. Hans stood in the ruins of a warehouse, looking west toward the empty steppe where German relief forces were supposed to be, and felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the moment, the precise moment, when certainty transformed into doubt. They were trapped in a dying city, winter was coming, and the supply situation was already critical. "General Paulus has ordered us to establish a perimeter and hold," Vogel said at the briefing. His hands no longer shook. They'd gone steady with the resignation of a man facing the inevitable. "The Führer has forbidden any breakout attempt. We are to hold Stalingrad at all costs. Relief is coming. Field Marshal von Manstein is organizing a rescue operation." "How long until relief?" Klaus asked, and Hans heard the boy's voice crack. 2 weeks, maybe 3. The Luftwaffe has promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily, more than enough to sustain us until the relief force arrives. Hans did the math in his head. 300,000 men, trapped in winter, supplied only by air. 500 tons sounded like a lot until you divided it among that many soldiers, until you factored in ammunition, fuel, medicine, food. It wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough. But orders were orders. They dug in, established defensive positions, and waited for the promised supplies. The first airlifts came on November 24th. The men watched hopefully as transport planes droned overhead, dropping containers by parachute into the snow. But there weren't many planes, a dozen, maybe 15. And when the containers were opened, they found fodder for horses, summer uniforms, and propaganda magazines. Someone had made a mistake. Or several mistakes. By early December, the truth was inescapable. The Luftwaffe couldn't deliver 500 tons per day. They were averaging barely 100 tons, and sometimes less. Soviet fighters harassed the transport planes, winter weather grounded flights for days at a time, and even when supplies did arrive, they were often the wrong items. Luxury goods meant for officers, equipment for units that no longer existed, anything but the food and ammunition the men desperately needed. The rations were cut. Then cut again. By mid-December, each man received 300 grams of bread per day, a thin soup made from God knows what, and occasionally a piece of horse meat from the thousands of horses being systematically slaughtered as they starved. Hans felt hunger become his constant companion. Not the pleasant hunger before a meal, but the deep, gnawing emptiness that made your hands shake and your thoughts slow and your body feel like it was consuming itself from the inside. And still it got colder. The temperature dropped to -20 Celsius, then -30. Men began losing fingers and toes to frostbite. The wounded died not from their injuries but from exposure and infection in the frozen ruins. The dead couldn't be buried, the ground was frozen solid, so they were stacked like cordwood in bombed-out buildings, frozen solid within hours. "The relief force is coming," Friedrich still insisted, but his face had hollowed out, his eyes sunken deep. "Von Manstein is pushing toward us. We just have to hold on a little longer." Hans no longer argued. What was the point? Either relief would come or it wouldn't. Either they'd live or they'd die. The certainty of September felt like a memory from another life. On December 12th, word spread through the ranks. Von Manstein's relief force had begun its attack, pushing toward Stalingrad from the southwest. Operation Winter Storm. The Sixth Army just had to hold on, maintain the defensive perimeter, wait for rescue. The men's spirits lifted slightly. Hope, thin and desperate, flickered in the ruins. But the Soviet forces had other plans. They counterattacked von Manstein's relief columns with savage intensity, slowing the advance to a crawl. And they maintained pressure on the Stalingrad pocket, attacking constantly, preventing any breakout attempt, bleeding the Sixth Army with 1,000 small cuts. By December 23, von Manstein's forces had reached Kotelnikovo, 50 kilometers from the Stalingrad pocket. So close enough that on quiet nights, Hans imagined he could hear the distant rumble of panzer tanks coming to save them. But they never arrived. Von Manstein couldn't push further. The Soviet forces were too strong, his own losses too heavy. On December 24, Christmas Eve, the relief operation was called off. Von Manstein's forces began withdrawing, leaving the Sixth Army to its fate. Hans learned this not from official channels but from Otto, who'd heard it from a radio operator who'd been listening to encoded transmissions. The officers didn't announce it. They couldn't. Admitting that relief had failed meant admitting they were going to die here. "So that's it then," Klaus said that Christmas Eve as they huddled in the frozen ruins of what had been a school. "We're abandoned." "We're not abandoned," Friedrich said automatically, but the words came out hollow. "There'll be another relief attempt. Or we'll break out. Or—" He trailed off. Even he couldn't sustain the lie anymore. Hans looked around at his squad, or what remained of it. Of the 38 men who'd entered Stalingrad in September, 11 remained. The rest were dead, wounded, missing, or so sick with dysentery and typhus that they'd been evacuated to the aid stations, which were themselves nightmares of frozen suffering. "Do you remember what today is?" Otto asked suddenly. "Christmas Eve," Klaus said. "Before the war, what would you be doing right now?" The question caught Hans off guard. Before the war felt impossibly distant, a world that might never have existed. But he forced himself to remember. "I'd be with my family in Hamburg. My mother would be cooking goose. My sister would be decorating the tree. We'd go to midnight mass, and my father would get slightly drunk on schnapps and tell the same stories he told every year. I'd be at my girlfriend's house," Klaus said softly. "Margaret. We were going to get married this Christmas. I sent her a letter in November, asking her to wait for me. I don't know if she got it." Friedrich said nothing, staring into the distance with eyes that saw things the others couldn't. They sat in silence as darkness fell and the temperature dropped further still. Somewhere in the ruins, someone had found a harmonica and was playing Still Nacht, Silent Night. The melody drifted across the frozen wasteland, and Hans felt tears freeze on his cheeks. This was when he knew. Not suspected, not feared, but knew with absolute certainty. They were going to die in Stalingrad. The new year brought no new hope. The Soviet forces, sensing victory, tightened their grip on the pocket. They launched a massive offensive on January 10th, Operation Ring, designed to crush the Sixth Army once and for all. The German defensive lines, weakened by hunger and cold and 3 months of constant fighting, began to crumble. Hans's unit was pushed back, then back again, surrendering ground they'd paid for in blood during the autumn fighting. The pocket shrank, from 50 kilometers wide to 40, to 30. The rations dropped to 200 grams of bread per day. Then 100 grams. Men were eating anything, leather from belts and boots, wallpaper paste, rats when they could catch them. The hospitals were overwhelmed, and soldiers with minor wounds were sent back to the line because there was no room, no medicine, no hope of treatment. Hans found himself fighting in streets he'd conquered in September, defending ruins he'd taken in October. It felt like a nightmare loop, the same battle fought over and over, except now they were losing. Klaus died on January 15th. Not in combat, he simply didn't wake up one morning. Froze to death in his sleep, his thin body unable to generate enough heat to survive the -40-degree night. Hans and Friedrich wrapped him in a tarp and added him to the stack of bodies behind their position. There was no time for words, no time for mourning. The living barely had energy to stay alive. "I had a letter from home," Friedrich said a few days later. They were sharing a cigarette, their last one, probably, in the shell of a building that might once have been a theater. From before the encirclement. My wife wrote that she's pregnant. I'm going to be a father. Hans didn't know what to say. Congratulations seemed obscene. I'm sorry seemed worse. I need to survive this, Friedrich continued, and his voice carried a desperate edge Hans had never heard before. I need to meet my child. I need to. A Soviet artillery shell screamed. The Soviet offensive cut the pocket in two. Hans's unit, along with what remained of the 6th Army's southern forces, was isolated in the southern pocket around the Red October factory. To the north, another pocket formed around the tractor factory. Between them, Soviet forces poured through, making any link-up impossible. Orders are to fight to the last man, Vogel said at what would be their final briefing. The lieutenant looked like a skeleton wrapped in a uniform now, his eyes huge in his sunken face. No surrender. Fight until ammunition is exhausted, then use grenades. When the grenades are gone, use bayonets. When? He stopped, unable to finish. What came after bayonets? Bare hands? Rocks? Surrender, which Hitler had expressly forbidden. Permission to speak, sir, Otto said. The old sergeant had survived against all odds, but he looked ancient now, a walking corpse animated only by stubbornness. We're going to die here, all of us. The question is whether we die for no reason, or whether we die trying to save what men we can. What are you suggesting? Vogel asked, and Hans heard no rebuke in the question, only exhaustion. The High Command doesn't care about us anymore. They've written us off. But we still care about each other. When the end comes, and it's coming soon, I suggest we don't follow orders that guarantee our death. I suggest we do whatever gives the most men the best chance of seeing home again. Treason. Otto was suggesting outright disobedience, and everyone in the room knew it. But no one spoke against it. Vogel was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. When the time comes, each man makes his own choice. I won't order surrender, but I won't order suicide either. Do what your conscience tells you. The Soviet forces overran Hans's position on the last day of January. They came at dawn, a wave of white camouflaged soldiers emerging from the snow like ghosts. Hans fired until his rifle was empty, then threw his last grenade, then fell back with the handful of men who could still move. They made it 3 blocks before encountering Soviet troops from another direction. Surrounded. Trapped. The end. Friedrich raised his rifle and Hans grabbed his arm. Don't. We're supposed to fight to the last. We're supposed to survive, Hans said, and threw down his weapon. Around him, the surviving men did the same. 11 of them left from a platoon that had been 38. They raised their hands and waited. The Soviet soldiers approached cautiously, weapons ready, expecting a trap. But there was no trap. Just exhausted, starving men who'd finally admitted what they'd known since December. They'd lost. Stalingrad had won. A Soviet officer approached, young, maybe younger than Klaus had been. He looked at the German soldiers with something that might have been pity. War over for you, he said in broken German. Now you live. Maybe. They were marched east, away from the ruins of Stalingrad, into Soviet captivity. Hans looked back once at the city that had consumed the 6th Army, at the smoke still rising from the ruins, at the frozen hell they'd fought so desperately to capture. Friedrich walked beside him, his face empty of expression. I won't see my child, he said quietly. I'll die in a prison camp. My wife will think I'm a coward for surrendering. Your wife will know you survived, Hans replied. That's more than most of these men can say. They walked in silence after that, a column of the defeated, joining thousands of other German soldiers streaming east into captivity. Of the 300,000 men who'd been trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, only 91,000 survived to surrender. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Hans was not one of them. Hans survived 2 months in the camps before typhus took him. He died in a frozen barracks surrounded by men he didn't know, his last thoughts of Hamburg and family and the life he'd never return to. Friedrich lasted longer, 3 years of captivity working in labor camps, surviving through luck and stubbornness. He returned to Germany in 1946, skeletal and broken, to find his son had never been born. His wife had miscarried, then remarried, believing Friedrich dead. He lived to be 73, haunted always by Stalingrad, by the certainty that had rotted into understanding too late. Otto, against all odds, survived captivity and returned home in 1949. He never spoke of Stalingrad, never attended veteran reunions, never told his grandchildren about the war. When he died in 1967, they found a single photograph among his belongings. The Second Company in September 1942, 38 men standing proud and confident in the ruins, believing themselves invincible. Lieutenant Vogel shot himself on February 1, 1943, rather than face captivity. His body was found frozen in the ruins of the command post, his service pistol still in his hand. General Paulus surrendered on February 2, becoming the first German field marshal ever to be taken prisoner. Hitler never forgave the Sixth Army for its defeat, publicly calling them cowards and traitors, erasing them from official histories even as their sacrifice bought time for the rest of the Wehrmacht to retreat and regroup. But the men who died in Stalingrad weren't cowards. They were soldiers who believed what they were told, who followed orders even when those orders became death sentences, who learned too late that certainty is the most dangerous illusion of war. They realized the truth that Stalingrad would be their grave. But by the time that understanding came, the trap had already closed and understanding changed nothing. The ruins of Stalingrad would become Volgograd, rebuilt and renamed, the scars of the battle buried under new construction. But the memory remained, of the battle that broke the Wehrmacht's myth of invincibility, of the city that refused to fall, of the 300,000 men who marched in as conquerors and died as prisoners of their own certainty. They knew they'd lost. They knew it in December when relief failed, knew it in January when rations dropped to starvation levels, knew it in those final days when survival meant choosing between death in battle and death in captivity. But knowing changed nothing. The war went on. The killing continued. And Stalingrad kept its promise, becoming the grave they'd marched toward with such confidence in those bright September days when victory seemed certain and the future full of promise. In the end, that was the cruelest lesson. Understanding your fate doesn't mean you can change it. Sometimes you realize you're going to die, and you keep fighting anyway, because there's nothing else left to do. That was Stalingrad, the place where German soldiers realized the war was lost, long before the war was over, and discovered that knowledge without power is just another form of suffering. The frozen steppe holds their bones still, 300,000 graves marking the place where certainty died and truth arrived too late to matter.
They came as conquerors, the pride of the Wehrmacht, veterans who had crushed Poland in weeks, swept through France in months, and believed themselves invincible. But Stalingrad was different. The city didn't fall, it consumed. Building by building, room by room, the Soviets fought for every brick, every basement, every stairwell. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came something the German soldiers had never experienced, the creeping realization that they might not leave this place alive. By November, surrounded and cut off, they began to understand the truth. The Luftwaffe's promised airlifts brought barely enough food to keep half the men alive. The Russian winter bit through their summer uniforms. And the Red Army tightened the noose with each passing day. This is the story of Oberstfreiter Hans Wegner and the men of the 6th Army's 71st Infantry Division, soldiers who watched their certainty crumble into snow and ash, who felt the moment their war changed from conquest to mere survival, and finally, to the desperate hope of dying with dignity in a city that had become their frozen tomb. Oberstfreiter Hans Wegner had seen many cities burn, but none quite like Stalingrad. From his position in the armored personnel carrier rattling toward the Volga River, he watched columns of black smoke twist into the pale September sky, merging into a vast darkness that blotted out the sun. The Luftwaffe had done its work well, too well, perhaps. The city ahead wasn't a city anymore but a landscape of rubble and flame. Looks like there won't be much left to capture, said Corporal Frederick Bohr from across the carrier, lighting a cigarette with hands that didn't shake. At 24, Frederick was 2 years younger than Hans but carried himself with the confidence of a man who would been proved right about everything. They'd served together since the invasion of France, and in all that time, Hans had never seen Frederick doubt their victory. "There'll be enough," Hans replied, checking his Karabiner 98K rifle for the third time that morning. The familiar weight of it was comfort and curse both. He'd used it to kill more men than he cared to count, and he knew he'd kill more before this was over. The carrier lurched to a stop near the outskirts of what their maps identified as the factory district. All around them, the sounds of the 6th Army settling into position, the rumble of panzer tanks moving into formation, the shouted orders of officers organizing their men, the steady rhythm of artillery being set up to hammer whatever resistance remained in the ruins ahead. Lieutenant Werner Vogel, their platoon commander, appeared at the carrier's edge. He was 32, an engineering teacher from Munich before the war, and he still carried himself like a man more comfortable with blueprints than battle plans. But he was competent, and that was enough. "We move in 20 minutes, Vogel said, his voice carrying the crisp authority expected of an officer. "Intelligence says Soviet resistance is scattered. The Basad ND army is collapsing. We push through the factory district, reach the Volga, and cut off their supply lines. After that, it's just a matter of cleaning up." Hans exchanged glances with Frederick, who grinned around his cigarette. They'd heard versions of this speech in Poland, in France, in the Russian steppes during the summer advance. So far, it had always been true. "How long do you think, sir?" asked Private Klaus Zimmermann, the youngest of their squad at barely 18. His face still had the softness of youth, though the summer campaign had burned his skin brown and put hard muscle on his farmer's frame. Vogel considered. "The city? A week, maybe 2. Then we winter in Stalingrad, regroup, and push for the Caucasus oil fields in spring. By this time next year, the war in the East will be over." The men nodded. It made sense. It always made sense when the officers explained it. The German war machine had proven unstoppable, the Wehrmacht's tactical superiority unquestionable. Why should Stalingrad be any different? They moved out on schedule, a platoon of 38 men weaving through the skeletal remains of apartment buildings and factories. The September sun beat down, and Hans felt sweat trickle down his back beneath his uniform. Summer uniforms, they'd been promised winter gear would arrive before the weather turned, but for now, the heat was enemy enough. The first contact came at an intersection near the Red October factory. Hans saw the muzzle flash half a second before the crack of the rifle, and training took over. He dove behind a chunk of concrete that might once have been a wall, brought his Kar 98K up, and scanned for the shooter. "Sniper. 2 o'clock, 3rd floor." Frederick's voice, calm as if he were commenting on the weather. Hans saw movement in a window frame, fired, worked the bolt, fired again. The movement stopped. But more shots came, from behind them, from the left, from positions that shouldn't have had any defenders. The Soviets weren't scattered. They were everywhere and nowhere, fighting from basements and cellars, from behind rubble piles that all looked the same, making every meter of advance cost blood. By nightfall, they'd advanced 3 blocks. 7 men were dead or wounded. It was more casualties than they'd taken in the entire French campaign. "Tomorrow will be easier," Vogel said that night, but Hans noticed the lieutenant's hands shook slightly as he lit his pipe. "Once we learn the terrain, once we clear out their positions." Hans said nothing. He'd learned in France that officers needed to believe their own words, and it didn't hurt to let them.